During extraction he refused to fall, the alien queen refused to leave him behind, HFY stories. The dropship was already burning when Sergeant Marcus Hale counted the bodies. Not counting the dead, counting the breathing ones, the ones he still had a chance to keep alive. 6 soldiers out of the 14 who'd hit the jungle floor of Kareth 41 hours ago. 6 people breathing in shallow, jagged pulls against the wet heat of a planet that had been trying to kill them since the moment the landing struts cracked open. Hale didn't let himself look at the other 8. Extraction window is 17 minutes, said Corporal Yusra Okonkwo, her voice flat with the specific exhaustion that comes after adrenaline stops being a resource and becomes a tax. She was crouched over the portable comms relay, fingers moving on autopilot, rerouting signal through the relay's backup transponder because the primary was somewhere in the burning wreckage of their ship. That's assuming the Resolute is still in orbital position. It is, Hale said. You don't know that. No, he admitted. But I'm operating like it is. He turned and looked at the tree line. The jungle of Kareth 4 was not like Earth jungle. It was older, denser, built from evolutionary pressure so extreme that even the plants had developed threat responses. Bioluminescent spores drifted between the canopy trunks like ghost signals, beautiful and toxic. The humidity was 94%. Every breath tasted like copper and rot. Somewhere out there the Kethayar were regrouping. That was the mission word, regrouping. What it actually meant was that the insectoid apex species of this planet, the ones humanity had been in tense diplomatic non-contact with for 6 years, had just finished a coordinated ambush that killed 8 trained soldiers in under 4 minutes. They were not retreating. They were thinking. Hale had seen combat on 3 worlds. He had never fought anything that thought the way the Kethayar thought. She's still watching us, said Private Rin Takahashi. He was 22, the youngest of the 6, and he was sitting against a root buttress with a field dressing wrapped tight around his left forearm. His eyes were fixed on a point 40 meters into the jungle. Hale followed his gaze. The Kethayar queen was standing at the jungle's edge. She was enormous, nearly 3 meters tall at the shoulder joint, her exoskeleton the deep amber of old bone, iridescent in the spore light. 6 limbs, 4 of which touched the ground in a posture that human xenobiologists had classified as observational rest. Her mandibles were still. Her compound eyes, each the size of a closed human fist, were oriented directly at their position. She had been standing there for 11 minutes. Since the ambush ended. Since her soldiers melted back into the canopy and she simply remained. Ignore her, Okonkwo said. Hard to ignore something that size, Takahashi said. Try. Hale didn't ignore her. Ignoring something that could decide to kill you was how you died. He watched her the way you watch a dog you're not sure about, steadily, without challenge, without submission. He kept his hands visible. He kept his breathing even. The queen's head tilted. 3 degrees left. It was such a small movement that he almost dismissed it. But in 41 hours on Kareth 4, Hale had learned to read the Kethayar the way sailors read weather, in small signs that meant large things. She was not preparing to attack. She was reading him. Marcus. That was Staff Sergeant Priya Delacroix behind him. Her voice had a weight to it that made him turn immediately. She was kneeling beside Private Amos Ferreira, who had been walking under his own power 20 minutes ago and was no longer doing so. Hale crossed to them in 4 steps. Ferreira's face was the color of wet concrete. His lips were moving but producing no sound. The field dressing on his thigh had soaked through, bright arterial red through brown-black, and the tourniquet above it had lost tension because Ferreira had been subtly loosening it for the past hour without telling anyone. Because Ferreira had decided he was already dead and was trying to make that decision quiet so the rest of them could focus. Amos. Hale dropped to one knee. Amos, look at me. Ferreira's eyes found his. There was something deeply tired in them. Retighten it, Hale said to Delacroix, who was already doing it. He kept his eyes on Ferreira. You don't get to decide that. Sarge. Not a request. You don't get to decide that unilaterally. That decision belongs to the team. Ferreira's jaw worked. I'm slowing you down. You are, Hale said. And we're still taking you. 15 minutes to the extraction window. Hale stood, turned, ran the geometry in his head. The extraction zone was 600 meters northeast. Ferreira couldn't walk. That meant a carry, 2 people rotating, burning energy they didn't have, moving at half speed through terrain that had already killed 8 of them. Through a jungle where a 3-meter apex predator was standing at the tree line, watching, thinking. He turned back to look at the queen. She hadn't moved. But something had changed in the quality of her stillness. He'd spent enough time around dangerous things, animals, people, machines, to know the difference between stillness that precedes violence and stillness that precedes communication. He did something that later, in the debrief, he would describe as an operational decision based on observed behavioral data. In truth, it was something older and less articulable than that. He took 3 steps toward her. Marcus, Okonkwo's voice was sharp. He held up a closed fist. Hold. He stopped at 20 meters. Close enough that he could see the fine sensory hairs along her foreleg joints vibrating, processing air pressure, chemical signals, the electromagnetic signature of his body heat. She was reading him with every sense she had. He pointed at Ferreira. Then he pointed northeast in the direction of the extraction zone. Then he held up his hand, fingers spread, 5, and folded them down one by one. 5 people moving. 1 can't. We are trying to leave. The Queen was absolutely still for 4 seconds. Then she made a sound. Low, subsonic, felt in the chest more than heard, and the jungle answered. Not with violence. With movement. Shapes in the canopy shifting. Repositioning. Hale didn't move. His heart rate was 130 beats per minute. His hands were steady. The Queen looked at him for a long moment with those immense compound eyes, and something that he would never be able to name passed between them, not understanding exactly, but the acknowledgement that understanding might be possible. Then she stepped back into the jungle and disappeared. She's gone, Takahashi said, disbelieving. No, she isn't, Hale said. He picked up his end of Ferreira's improvised stretcher. Move. 14 minutes. He was right. She wasn't gone. But what she did next, none of them were prepared for. The Kethair didn't have a word for mercy. This is what xenolinguist Dr. Sir Shembeki would explain, 3 months later, in a paper that became simultaneously the most downloaded and most contested document in the history of the Coalition Xenological Institute. The Kethair language, a system of subsonic vibration, chemical emission and precise physical posture, had no construct that mapped onto the human concept of mercy as unearned forgiveness or compassionate restraint. What they had instead was a word that roughly translated as Kethvera. The closest human equivalent was something like the obligation of a superior predator to acknowledge worthy prey. Not mercy. Not kindness. Something older and, arguably, more honest. Mbecky's paper was contested because it implied something uncomfortable, that the Queen's decision to shadow Sergeant Hale's extraction was not an act of grace. It was an act of recognition. She had watched 14 humans land on her world. She had watched 8 of them die. She had watched the 6 who remained, exhausted, wounded, outmatched, refuse to abandon their most vulnerable member and begin moving anyway. And she had made a decision based on that data. The Kethair had been apex predators for 40 million years. They had not maintained that position through strength alone. They had maintained it through an extraordinarily sophisticated calculus of threat assessment, not just who could hurt them but who was worth hurting, who represented a meaningful test, who, by the standards of their own moral framework, deserved the dignity of being taken seriously. Hale, carrying Ferreira through 600 meters of hostile jungle with 11 minutes to extraction, had apparently crossed a threshold. But that analysis came later. In the moment, what Hale knew was this. They were 400 meters from the extraction zone, 6 minutes behind his optimal pace, and something was moving in the canopy above them at exactly the speed they were moving. Not faster. Not slower. Parallel. It's her, Okonkwo said quietly, scanning upward through the trees. She'd caught a flash of amber exoskeleton between the canopy gaps. I count at least 4 others with her. They're flanking us, Delacroix said. Her hand was near her sidearm. No, Hale said. How do you know? Because the firing lines were wrong. If the Kethair wanted them dead, they would have closed the angles by now. The jungle had enough choke points that 4 soldiers could have cornered 6 exhausted humans in the time it took to say the word ambush. They weren't closing. They were maintaining distance. A fixed distance, roughly 15 meters on each side, above and laterally, that created a corridor. They were being escorted. Don't raise weapons, Hale said. Nobody raises weapons. We keep moving. Ferreira, drifting in and out of consciousness on the stretcher, muttered something that sounded like an argument. Hale ignored it. 300 meters. The jungle was doing something strange. The bioluminescent spores, which had been drifting in random currents all night, were now flowing in a distinct direction. Northeast. Toward the extraction zone. As if something was generating a directed air current. As if something was clearing the path. Are they? Takahashi started. Don't question it, Hale said. Move. 200 meters. They hit a natural obstacle, a root system that had heaved up from a ground collapse, creating a 2-meter vertical scramble that would have been trivial for an unencumbered soldier and was nearly impossible with a stretcher case. Hale looked at it, did the math on time and energy, felt something cold in his chest. A shadow fell across them. One of the Kethair, not the Queen, a smaller one, though smaller was relative when you were looking at something 2.2 meters tall, had dropped from the canopy to the top of the root wall. It looked at them with the same quality of assessment the Queen had used. Then it reached down with one massive foreleg, extended a 3-jointed appendage that Hale's brain categorized insistently as a hand even though it wasn't, and braced itself. An offer of leverage. Of a handhold on the far side. Nobody moved for a full second. "Take it," Hale said. "Sarge." Okonkwo's voice had a careful quality, like she was choosing not to say several other things. "We're wasting time. Take it." Takahashi went first because he was the youngest and the least calcified in his assumptions, and he grabbed the offered limb without letting himself think about it. The Kethair held steady, rock steady, with a solidity that felt geological, and Takahashi pulled himself up and over. They passed Ferreira up like cargo. The Kethair adjusted its grip without being asked, supporting the stretcher's weight on the near side while Hale and Delacroix guided it from below. 45 seconds. They were over the obstacle. The Kethair was gone before any of them could look at it directly again. 100 meters. Hale could see open sky through the canopy. The extraction zone was a natural clearing, 80 meters of flat ground that the Resolute's pilots had flagged as a viable landing site before everything went wrong. He could hear, distantly, the subsonic vibration of a dropship on descent approach. He keyed his comms. Resolute Hale. 6 personnel, 1 critical. Extraction zone in 60 seconds. Do not abort. Static. Then, copy Hale. We have your signal. 60 seconds. He ran the last 100 meters. At the jungle's edge he stopped and turned. Not because he had to. Because it felt necessary. The Queen was standing at the tree line again. Same posture. Same stillness. Same compound eyes, oriented precisely at him. Hale held her gaze. Then he did something he hadn't planned and couldn't explain. He placed his right fist against his chest. Not a salute, not anything from military protocol. Just a gesture that his body seemed to produce on its own, from some pre-linguistic place, as the closest physical approximation of acknowledgement he could generate in 3 seconds. The Queen's mandibles moved. A small motion. Precise. He would later learn from Becky's paper that the gesture was a Kethair signal meaning approximately. You were measured and found not wanting. The dropship touched down behind him. Fleet Admiral Constance Yevgenia read the after-action report twice before she read the attached xenological notation once. The report was clean, professional, and almost entirely useless. It described, in the careful passive voice of military documentation, what had happened on Kareth 4 in terms of operational metrics. Insertion timeline, casualty count, asset loss, extraction success. It described Sergeant Marcus Hale's tactical decision to engage in nonverbal signaling with indigenous apex organism as a measured and outcome-positive choice, which was the kind of language that meant we have no framework for what actually happened here, so we're using the framework we have. The xenological notation was 3 paragraphs, appended by a colonial science liaison who'd been in the Resolute's analysis bay when the extraction footage came through. It said, essentially, this behavioral sequence from the Kethair Queen does not match any cataloged protocol. Recommend immediate review by specialist. Yevgenia set down both documents and looked out the viewport at the star field. In 31 years of service, she had watched humanity contact 7 intelligent species. Of those 7, 3 were now allies, 2 were in active conflict, 1 had gone silent, and 1, the Kethair, had been classified as unresolved. Not enemy. Not friend. A species that had observed humanity's arrival in their system with the patient, unreadable attention of something that had not yet decided. She had been in enough negotiations to know the difference between an enemy that hadn't attacked yet and a neutral that was still watching. The Kethair were watching. Had been watching for 6 years. Until 11 days ago, when a sergeant who was running out of options had looked a 3-meter predator in the eye and made a gesture that said, across every barrier of biology and language and evolutionary history, I see you. Yevgenia pulled up Hale's service file. 34 years old. Born in Lagos. Enlisted at 18, career trajectory marked by consistent commendations for situational judgment and 1 serious disciplinary note from a mission on Callus 2 where he'd refused an order he deemed tactically incoherent and turned out to be right. The kind of soldier who was too valuable to promote away from the field and too independent to promote toward command. His commander's notes used phrases like instinctive threat reader and exceptional environmental adaptation and, from one frustrated lieutenant colonel, operates from a different logic than the rest of us, and I cannot determine if this is an asset or a liability. The footage from the extraction was 16 minutes long. Yevgenia watched all of it. She watched the Queen emerge at the jungle's edge. She watched Hale count to some internal number and then walk toward her. 3 steps, 2 meters, something that every tactical framework she knew would classify as a suicidal misread of an apex predator's posture. She watched him make the pointing gesture, the counting gesture, the thing that shouldn't have worked. She watched it work. She watched the escort. The spore currents redirecting. The Kethar soldier at the root wall, extending a limb that the footage captured in clinical detail. The deliberate, measured offer of it, held absolutely steady while a human soldier grabbed on and pulled himself to safety. She watched Hale turn at the jungle's edge and place his fist against his chest. She watched the Queen's mandibles move. Then she called her chief diplomatic liaison and said, "I need you to find someone who can tell me if what I just watched was an accident or an opening." The answer came back in 8 hours. Dr. Sersham Beki, the coalition's leading Kethar behavioral specialist, had been watching the footage on loop for 6 of those hours, running comparison analyses against every piece of Kethar behavioral data collected in 6 years of observation. She came back with one sentence before she could get to a full report. "Admiral, that was not an accident. That was an introduction." Hale was in the Resolute's medical bay when Yevgenia's summons came. Ferreira was in surgery 3 rooms down. The surgeons had been working on him for 6 hours and expected to work for 4 more, but the prognosis had shifted from "prepare yourself" to "we think we can save the leg." Hale had been told this 40 minutes ago and had not moved from the chair outside the surgical bay since. He was not sleeping. He was doing something that looked like sleeping but was actually the particular stillness of a person running a continuous loop of everything they might have done differently. The summons came through his personal comm. He read it, stood up, looked at the surgical bay door for a moment and said quietly to no one, "I'll be back." Then he went. The conference room aboard the Resolute was too small for what was being asked of it. Yevgenia sat at one end. Hale sat at the other. Between them, Dr. Mbeki via secure relay, her face slightly pixelated from the compression lag, Commander Theo Asante, the ship's senior diplomatic officer, who kept his hands very still on the table in the way of someone exercising considerable restraint, and lieutenant commanders from intelligence, xenology and medical, all of whom had been told to observe and not speak. Hale looked like a man who hadn't slept in 2 days because he hadn't slept in 2 days. He looked at Yevgenia with the careful attentiveness of someone waiting to find out if they were in trouble. "You're not in trouble," Yevgenia said. "I know, Admiral." "Walk me through the decision to approach her." Hale was quiet for a moment. "Not hesitating, organizing. I've been in situations where the outcome depends on reading intent correctly and acting on that read before you have confirmation. You wait for confirmation, sometimes the window closes. Sometimes the window is the moment." He paused. She wasn't postured for an attack. Her soldiers had already broken contact. She was alone at the tree line, oriented toward us, not moving. In any situation I've been in, human or otherwise, that posture means the entity is waiting to see what you'll do. It's a test, not a threat. And you've observed this in non-human species before? Not at that scale. But the principle seems to hold. Becky's voice came through the relay. "Sergeant, I've been studying Kethar behavioral data for 6 years. You identified a behavioral signal in real time that our analytical systems flagged as ambiguous. Can you tell me how?" Hale thought about it. Her breathing changed. The sensory hairs on her foreleg joints, I don't know the right word for them. "CD," Becky said. Her CD went from high-frequency motion to low-frequency. When something is in threat mode, everything about it is faster. She slowed down. That meant she was making a decision, not executing one. Silence on the relay. Then Becky said, with the careful tone of someone recalibrating a significant assumption, "That is a correct reading of Kethar predecision behavioral indicators. We identified that pattern in archive footage after 8 months of analysis. You identified it in real time after 41 hours on the planet." "I grew up reading dogs," Hale said. "Then I read people in bad situations. Then aliens. The variables change. The underlying thing doesn't." Asante leaned forward slightly. "Sergeant, in your estimation, and I understand this is speculation, what do you think the Queen was evaluating during those 11 minutes she stood at the tree line?" Hale was quiet for longer this time. When he spoke, the room was very still. "Whether we were worth the trouble," he said. "Not we as in humans in general. We as in, This specific group in this specific situation. She'd already made a decision about the 14 who landed. 8 of them were gone. She was watching what the 6 who were left did next. Pause. I think she was watching to see if we'd leave Ferreira. Yevgenia said, and when you didn't? When we didn't? And then when I walked toward her instead of away. He looked at his hands. I think she'd already made the decision before I reached her. I just confirmed it. Becky's voice was different when she spoke again. Lower. The gesture at the end. When you placed your fist against your chest at the extraction zone. Yeah. Why? Another long pause. Because she did something real. She didn't have to do it. Whatever the calculus was, she made a choice that cost her something. Standing at that tree line, having her soldiers escort us, letting that one come down and help with the root wall. I don't know what it cost her in terms of her own hierarchy or her own internal logic. But it cost something. And it seemed wrong to walk away from that without acknowledging it. That's the correct cultural response, Becky said. Or as close to correct as a human has ever spontaneously produced. The Kethair don't have a word for gratitude as an abstract virtue. But they have a very specific protocol for acknowledging an exchange of measured risk. What you did maps almost precisely onto it. A beat. How did you know? I didn't, Hale said. It just seemed right. Yevgenia let the room be quiet for a moment. Then she said, Dr. Mbeki, you used the word introduction in your preliminary assessment. Explain that. Becky's pixelated face shifted. Something that might have been the expression of a scientist choosing between precision and accessibility. She chose accessibility. The Kethair have been watching us for 6 years, she said. In that time they've made contact, real, intentional, communicative contact. Exactly once. What happened on Kareth 4 11 days ago. They initiated it. They chose the parameters. They chose the subject. Pause. They chose Sergeant Hale. The question I've been trying to answer is whether this was a one-time event or a signal of ongoing intent. And? Yevgenia said. The Queen is still at the jungle's edge, Becky said. She's been there for 11 days. Her soldiers rotate. She doesn't leave. She is waiting. The room was very quiet. Waiting for what? Sandy asked. For us to send someone back, Becky said. Everyone in the room looked at Hale. Hale looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up at Yevgenia. Ferreira's surgery, he said. When does he get cleared? 4 weeks, minimum. I'll go back in 4 weeks. I'm not going before then. Yevgenia studied him. She may not wait 4 weeks. She's waited 6 years, Hale said. She'll wait 4 weeks. He was right. 4 weeks and 2 days later, a single coalition dropship settled into the same clearing on Kareth 4. No military escort. Command had argued for a full diplomatic team, xenolinguists, security detail, cultural liaisons, recording equipment, 3 layers of command oversight. Hale had listened to all of it in a conference room in Geneva and then said, with a patience that was clearly costing him something, she didn't come out for any of that. She came out for a sergeant carrying a wounded man. If you send a committee, she'll disappear, and you'll have spent a diplomatic window that took 6 years to open. The compromise was, Hale, Mbeki, 1 security officer, Okonkwo, who Hale had specifically requested, and a comm relay that could transmit everything back to the Resolute in real time. No weapons displayed. No diplomatic uniforms. Hale wore his field kit. Mbeki wore field kit. Okonkwo wore field kit and kept her sidearm holstered and her hands visible. Ferreira had wanted to come. Hale had sat with him for an hour in the recovery ward and listened to the argument with full attention before saying, when you can walk without pain, you'll come. Not before. Ferreira had said, she's waiting for you, not me. Maybe, Hale said. But you're the reason she's waiting. So we do this right. The clearing was exactly as Hale remembered it. Same broken canopy, same bioluminescent drift of spores, same copper and rot weight to the air. Different light. It was late afternoon here, and the sky above the canopy gap was the deep amber violet of Kareth IV's long dusk. The Queen emerged from the jungle 30 seconds after the dropship's engines cycled down. She was exactly as he remembered, which surprised him. He'd half expected his memory to have diminished her somehow. That's what time does to extreme experience, it compresses and softens the edges. She was not diminished. She was 3 meters of evolutionary authority, amber exoskeleton iridescent in the dusk light, compound eyes oriented toward the ship's loading ramp. Hale walked down the ramp alone. He stopped at the same distance as before, 20 meters. He kept his hands visible. His breathing was even. Mbeki in his earpiece, She's presenting forward mandibles in a neutral position. That's a greeting posture. Marcus, she's greeting you. Hale placed his fist against his chest. The queen's mandibles moved, the same small, precise motion as before. Then she did something new. She lowered her body toward the ground, not a collapse, a deliberate controlled motion, a smooth declension of her massive frame until her foreleg joints touched the earth and her eye line dropped to his level. She's reducing her height presentation, Mbeki breathed. We've never seen them do that voluntarily. That's a signal of meeting at the same level. She's trying to put herself at your height. Looking at her now, her compound eyes at his level, enormous and faceted and utterly alien, Hale felt something that he couldn't have named in the debrief and wouldn't have tried to. Not awe exactly, not fear, but the very specific sensation of standing at the exact edge of something, looking into a space where the old maps ran out and the territory was real. He sat down on the ground. Cross-legged, in the dirt of an alien planet, in front of a creature that could kill him in 3 seconds, he sat down and brought himself to her level. Behind him, he heard Okonkwo make a sound that wasn't a word. In his earpiece, Mbeki was silent for a moment. Then, Marcus. The CD. Her CD just shifted to low frequency. The queen looked at him for a long time with those immense eyes. Then, slowly, she reached out one foreleg, the same limb that her soldier had extended at the root wall 4 weeks ago, and placed it on the ground between them. Not touching him. On the ground. In the space between. Hale looked at it. He looked at her. He reached out his hand and placed it on the ground in the same space. Not touching her. In the space between. A gesture that met hers without breaching the distance. Mbeki's voice was very quiet. That's the first intentional cross-species physical boundary negotiation in Kethar contact history. She offered the space. You received it. That's a completed exchange. That's the beginning of a protocol. The dusk light deepened around them. Spores drifted between. The jungle breathed. Hale and the Queen of Kareth 4 sat at the same level in the space between their worlds, neither fully in the other's territory, and for 40 minutes, which would later be analyzed second by second, frame by frame, by every xenological institution in the coalition, they communicated without a single word. It took 7 months to understand what had been agreed to in those 40 minutes. The process was not translation. Translation implies shared vocabulary. It was something closer to archaeology, the careful excavation of meaning from gesture, posture, chemical signal, and the spatial relationship between two bodies in a clearing at dusk. Becky led the work. She brought in specialists from 11 institutions. She went back to Kareth 4 times, twice with Hale and twice alone, each visit generating new data that revised the previous analysis. What emerged, gradually and with significant dissent among experts about specific interpretations, was this. The Queen had not simply let them go. She had made, in the language of her own civilization, an offer. The offer was not articulated in the human sense, declared, stated, documented. It was enacted. The escort through the jungle, the soldier at the root wall, the 11 days of waiting at the tree line, these were not random behaviors. They were a structured sequence. A Kethar formal proposition. The proposition, translated with all appropriate caveats about the inherent violence of translation across biological and cognitive difference, was something like, "You have demonstrated that you operate by a code we recognize. If you return and demonstrate that this was not an anomaly, we will discuss terms." Terms was another contested translation. The Kethar concept was closer to mutual threshold agreement, an acknowledgement by two parties of where each one's boundaries were and what crossing them meant. Not a treaty in the human sense. Something older. Something that predated the written word by, in the Kethar's case, approximately 30 million years. Hale's return and the 40 minutes in the clearing had been the demonstration. The Queen had watched him sit down. She had watched him reduce himself deliberately to a non-threatening physical posture, not out of submission because she could read the difference, but out of the choice to meet rather than tower. She had watched him receive her offered space without overreaching it. She had watched him stay in stillness for 40 minutes without fidgeting, without checking his comm, without any of the behavioral signals that indicated an entity uncomfortable with the duration of the present moment. She had been testing, Mbeki concluded, for patience. For the specific quality of attention that says, I am here entirely. I'm not managing this moment towards something else. I am in it. The Kethar have a concept, Mbeki explained, in the paper that was not contested, the one that became required reading at the Coalition Diplomatic Institute within a year of publication, that roughly translates as full presence. It is, in their framework, the most fundamental prerequisite for any meaningful exchange. You cannot negotiate, communicate, or share a boundary with an entity that is not entirely in the moment with you. Partial presence is not recognized as contact. It is recognized as noise. Hale, apparently, had been entirely present. This was, Becky noted, not as unusual among combat veterans as among civilians. People who have learned to attend completely to a present environment, because inattention has cost them or people they loved, carry a quality of presence that registers across biological categories. The Kethayar had been watching humanity for 6 years and finding it largely noisy. The 7th month brought something no one had anticipated. The Queen sent an envoy to the Resolute. Not a soldier. Not a subordinate. A Kethayar whom Becky's behavioral analysis categorized as occupying a role with no direct human equivalent. Something like a witness keeper, an entity whose function was to be present at moments of threshold significance and remember them with absolute precision. The envoy carried nothing in the physical sense. What it carried was a Kethayar memory sequence, a structured pattern of chemical and vibrational signals that Becky spent 3 weeks learning to read with the help of newly developed sensor arrays. The memory sequence was a record of what the Queen had seen on the day of the extraction. Not what had happened. What she had seen. The subtle, crucial distinction being that it was her interpretation. Her reading of the event, through the framework of Kethayar values and Kethayar attention and 40 million years of apex predator cognition. What she had seen in her own record. A group of 6 creatures, exhausted and wounded, who could have survived more easily by leaving one of their number behind. She had watched them choose not to. She had watched the one in command, the one who moved differently, who read his environment the way the Kethayar recognized as correct, choose the harder path without hesitation, without resentment, without the behavioral signals of an entity performing nobility for an audience. She had watched him choose it because it was, to him, simply what you did. And then she had watched him see her, really see her, not as a threat to manage but as an entity to meet, and walk toward her instead of away. The memory sequence ended with a Kethayar notation that Becky translated, with shaking hands, as, "This one operates from a code older than language. We recognize the code." The formal contact agreement between the Coalition of Human Worlds and the Kethayar Sovereign Collective was signed. If signed, is the right word for a process that involved 7 months of behavioral negotiation, for threshold meetings in a clearing on Kareth 4, and a final session in which both parties sat at the same level on the ground and enacted, in physical space, the terms they had reached, in the 4th year after the extraction. It was not a treaty in any form that international lawyers initially recognized. It had no clauses, no enforcement mechanisms, no arbitration protocols. What it had was a set of acknowledged thresholds, things each party agreed to recognize as meaningful, as worth protecting, as the territory inside which they would not venture without explicit invitation. It was, in the end, more durable than most treaties. Because it wasn't based on what each party had agreed to do. It was based on what each party had demonstrated they were. Sergeant Marcus Hale attended the agreement ceremony as a civilian. He'd retired 6 months earlier, quietly, without ceremony, submitting his papers on a Tuesday and spending the rest of the week at a hospital in Sao Paulo where Amos Ferreira was doing his 3rd round of physical therapy on the leg that the surgeons had saved. Ferreira walked with a slight hitch that would probably never fully resolve. He walked. Hale had been there every 3rd week. The agreement ceremony was on Kareth 4. In the clearing. The same clearing. Hale stood at the tree line and watched the diplomats and xenologists and command staff go through the formal process in the clearing center. Yevgenia was there, and Becky and Asante, and a dozen others whose work over 4 years had made the moment possible. He wasn't in the center. He was at the tree line because that's where she was. The Queen stood beside him, not at a diplomatic distance, not at a formal remove, but beside him, the way 2 people stand who have stood together before and know the measure of each other's presence. Her compound eyes were oriented toward the clearing. His were too. She made a low sound. Subsonic. Felt in the chest. He'd learned some of it by then. Not language. You couldn't learn Kethayar language in 4 years, not fully, not without sensory apparatus he didn't have. But the broad shapes of it. The emotional registers. The sound meant something like, "This is what comes from not falling." He thought about Ferreira on the stretcher. About the stretcher's weight and the sweat and the 16 minutes of running geometry in his head. About 8 people who hadn't made it and 6 who had. About a decision that had seemed, in the moment, like the only possible decision, and had apparently been, to a set of eyes watching from the jungle's edge, something more than that. He placed his fist against his chest. The Queen's mandibles moved. Small. Precise. In the clearing, the diplomats were completing the threshold enactment. The junior xenologists were recording everything. Somewhere back on the Resolute, Mbeki was watching on a relay feed with the expression she wore when the world was doing something she had hoped for but not quite believed in. Hale stood at the tree line of Kareth 4 in the amber violet of its late afternoon and felt the weight of the last 4 years settle and resolve into something that didn't have a word in any language he knew. Not peace exactly. Something more earned than peace. Something that happened on the other side of not falling, when you'd carried the weight long enough that it stopped being something you bore and started being something you'd become. The Queen was still beside him. The jungle breathed around them both. Yeah, he said softly to no one, to both of them. I know. In the archives of the Coalition Xenological Institute, the Kareth 4 contact is classified under a category that was created specifically for it, Type 1 Threshold Contact. Initiated through behavioral demonstration, formalized through presence, sustained through consistency of character. The classification notes that Type 1 contact cannot be manufactured, diplomatically engineered, or strategically designed. It can only be earned. The file contains 16 minutes of extraction footage, 40 minutes of clearing footage, and one note from Dr. Sersham Mbeki, written on the day the agreement was completed. We spent 6 years trying to find the right words. It turned out the right thing wasn't a word at all. It was a man who didn't leave someone behind, and then looked up and let himself be seen.